Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 200,000 children were loaded onto trains in New York City and sent west. The Children's Aid Society, the institution responsible for most of these placements, kept records. Detailed ones. Ledgers. Intake forms. Transfer documents. Family placement cards. 75 years of administrative paperwork generated by an organisation that was, by all contemporary accounts, meticulous about documentation. Fewer than 30% of those records have ever been matched to a confirmed child. That is not a rounding error. That is not the natural decay of 19th century paperwork. 140,000 children moved across a continent, placed into homes by an institution that wrote everything down, and the paper trail, for the overwhelming majority of them, leads nowhere. It ends mid-sentence. It references documents that no longer exist. It names placement agents whose own records were never filed, or were filed and then quietly removed from the archive that was supposed to hold them permanently. The official explanation is incomplete record keeping, the chaos of the era, and the inevitable deterioration of documents over time. But the Children's Aid Society was not a chaotic organisation. It was funded by some of the wealthiest reformers in American history. It had a central office, it had regional correspondence, it had a publishing operation that produced annual reports and promotional literature with the precision of a modern corporation. Organisations that precise do not lose 70% of their records to carelessness. So the question is not why the records are incomplete. The question is which records are missing, when they disappeared, and whether their disappearance follows a pattern that incomplete record keeping alone cannot explain. The first thing you notice when you begin examining the surviving documentation seriously is that the gaps are not random. Random document loss looks like a fog thin in places, dense in others, but distributed across the whole. What researchers who have spent years in the archive describe finding is something different. Specific years are nearly empty. Specific receiving states have almost no surviving intake records. Specific categories of children, those listed in intake documents as having living relatives, those whose ethnicity was recorded in particular ways, those who arrived in the largest single-year cohorts, are disproportionately absent from the surviving record. Historian Marilyn Holt, whose 1992 study of the Orphan Trains remains the most thorough academic examination of the programme, documented that placement records for the years 1873 through 1881, the programme's period of most rapid expansion, are the least complete of any era in the archive's history. Those 8 years represent the movement of an estimated 40,000 children. Fewer than 6,000 have surviving placement documentation. That is a documentation rate of 15% for the busiest period in the programme's history. Holt's examination also found something that the archive's official inventory did not mention. The placement records for Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri, 3 of the highest volume receiving states, contain systematic gaps in their agent correspondence files. The agents who physically accompanied children on the trains were required to file reports after each placement. For those 3 states, in those years, the filing rate in the surviving record is under 20%. Consider what that means structurally. An agent accompanies 30 children from New York to a stop in rural Kansas. He places 28 of them with families over 3 days. He is required, by the Society's own internal protocols, to send a placement report to the central office for each child. That report would include the child's name as recorded at intake, the name and address of the receiving family, and an initial assessment of the placement's suitability. For those 3 states, in those 8 years, 4 out of every 5 of those reports are simply gone. The archive holds their absence the way a room holds the outline of furniture that has been removed. You can see where they should be. The files are labelled, the folders exist, the reports are not in them. To understand why this matters beyond the personal tragedy of individual children, you need to understand what the Orphan Train programme was, who built it, and what it was genuinely trying to accomplish, because the official history and the operational reality were not always the same thing. Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853, 1 year before the first train departed. He was 27 years old. He was a Yale-educated minister who had spent several years observing the condition of street children in New York, children who slept in doorways, worked as rag pickers, sold newspapers at ages 5 and 6, and existed entirely outside the structures of family, church, and school that Victorian reform movements considered essential to a functional society. Brace was not indifferent to these children. His genuine concern for their welfare is documented extensively in his own writing. But his solution was shaped by a philosophy that is important to understand clearly. He believed that the urban environment itself was the corrupting force, that poverty was partly environmental in origin, and that removing children from that environment, placing them in rural homes where physical labour, Protestant morality, and family structure would reshape them, was an act of salvation. He also believed that most of these children were effectively unclaimed. Orphans, in the popular imagination of the 1850s, meant children without any family at all. But a significant portion of the children who moved through the Children's Aid Society's system were not orphans in that strict sense. They had living parents. They had siblings. They had grandparents, aunts and uncles. They were poor, and in the Victorian calculus that shaped Brace's institution, poverty could function as a kind of legal orphanhood, a condition that justified intervention and relocation even when biological family existed. Between 1854 and 1880, no uniform federal law governed the placement of children across state lines. Individual states had varying levels of child welfare oversight, and many had none. The Children's Aid Society operated largely by its own standards, which it set, enforced, and evaluated internally. By 1875, the Society was placing between 2,000 and 3,000 children per year. By 1880, that number had climbed further. The infrastructure of the operation, the trains, the receiving agents, the promotional literature sent to Western towns inviting families to attend distribution days was functioning at industrial scale. And then, in 1882, the Society restructured its record-keeping system. The restructuring was announced in that year's annual report as a modernisation, an improvement in administrative efficiency. But when researchers today examine what happened to the documentation generated before 1882, they find that the older format records, the ones covering the programme's first 28 years, were not uniformly transferred into the new system. Some were, many were not. And the ones that were not transferred were, in a significant number of cases, not preserved in any other location either. The restructuring happened, not incidentally, in the same year that several receiving states began passing legislation requiring more formal documentation for child placements. Indiana in 1882, Illinois the following year. The documentation requirements those laws created applied to placements going forward. The records generated before those laws existed remain governed only by the Society's internal standards, which means the records most likely to contain legally problematic information, placements of children with living relatives, placements made without verifiable consent, placements whose documentation would not have survived external scrutiny, were the records that fell outside the new legal framework entirely. The second pattern runs parallel to the first, and it is, in some ways, harder to look at directly. The children who arrived at distribution days across Kansas, Nebraska, Indiana, Missouri, and Illinois were presented to waiting families in a manner that has been described, by contemporary observers as well as later historians, as resembling a market. Children stood on platforms or in meeting halls. Families walked through, examined them, asked questions. Selections were made. This is not in dispute. Contemporary newspaper accounts from receiving towns describe the process in precisely those terms, sometimes with evident approval, occasionally with discomfort, but consistently with enough specificity that the mechanics of the selection process are well documented. What is less well documented, what the Children's Aid Society's own records are most consistently incomplete about, is what happened after the selection. The Society's stated policy was that placements were not adoptions. Children placed with families retained, in theory, a connection to the Society, which was supposed to conduct follow-up visits to verify that placements were appropriate. Agents in receiving states were supposed to check in on placed children, report on their conditions, and flag cases where the placement had become exploitative or abusive. The follow-up visit records are among the most systematically absent documents in the archive. For the decade of the 1870s, the Society placed an estimated 25,000 children. The surviving follow-up visit documentation for that cohort accounts for fewer than 1,200 children. That is a follow-up documentation rate of under 5%. Jennifer Toth, a journalist who spent several years interviewing descendants of orphan train riders in the 1990s, collected testimony from families across the Midwest and Plains states. A consistent pattern emerged in those interviews. Grandparents and great-grandparents who had been orphan train children frequently described their placement families not as adoptive parents, but as employers. They were farm labour. They were domestic servants. They were workers in small family businesses. Some were genuinely loved. Many were not. Several, in recorded interviews that Toth documented, described conditions that would be recognised today as labour exploitation of a minor. The Society's annual reports from the same period consistently described the placements in the language of family formation. Warm homes. Christian families. The redemptive power of Western life. Both things were true for some children. The question that the missing follow-up records cannot answer is what the actual ratio was. Without systematic follow-up documentation, it is impossible to know, at any institutional scale, what proportion of placements became families, what proportion became labour arrangements, and what proportion became something that the Society would have had strong institutional reasons not to document clearly. The records that would answer that question are the records that are most comprehensively gone. Let that sit for a moment. Here is where the two patterns converge, and where the combined weight of what is documented and what is absent becomes something that cannot be explained by administrative accident alone. The children most likely to have been placed in exploitative labour arrangements were also the children least likely to have surviving family connections that would generate outside inquiry. A child with living parents somewhere in New York's Lower East Side, a parent who might eventually attempt to find them, a sibling who might grow up and ask questions, was a potential liability to an institution whose operations did not fully survive external scrutiny. Researcher Clark Kidwell, examining intake records at the New York State Archives in the early 2000s, found something that the Society's own published histories did not mention. A category of intake notation that appears in records from the 1860s and early 1870s, and then disappears almost entirely after 1880. The notation, written in various forms across different intake clerks' handwriting, indicated whether a child had a living parent or near relative who had not formally consented to the placement. In the surviving records from those years, that notation appears on approximately 18% of intake documents. 18% of the children being placed had known living relatives who had not formally consented to the relocation. After 1880, that notation stops appearing, not because the category of child it described stopped arriving at the Society's doors. The immigrant populations of New York that generated those children continued to grow throughout the 1880s and 1890s. It stops appearing because, researchers believe, the Society was aware by that point that the notation created a documentary record that was legally problematic in an era of increasing state oversight. The notation didn't stop being true. The documentation of its truth stopped being made. And the records from the years when it was made most consistently, the 1860s and early 1870s, are the records with the lowest survival rate in the entire archive. The absence of a document is not proof of what the document said. But when a specific category of information appears to have been systematically avoided in later records, And the earlier records that did capture that information are the ones that are most comprehensively missing. The shape of that absence begins to form a question that is more specific than general record loss can explain. In 1930, 1 year after the last Orphan Train ran, the Children's Aid Society commissioned an internal historical review of the programme. The review was conducted by the Society's own staff and was never published publicly. Its existence is documented in the Society's own institutional history. Its conclusions have never been made available to outside researchers. The New York Public Library holds a partial collection of Children's Aid Society materials. The Welfare History Archive at the University of Minnesota holds another portion. A third collection exists at the New York State Archives. Researchers who have worked across all three collections have noted that the three collections do not fully overlap. Documents present in one are absent in the others, and in some cases, documents referenced in the finding aids of one collection appear to have been removed at some point after the finding aids were created. In 2007, a genealogist named Mary Ellen Johnson, who spent decades trying to help Orphan Train descendants locate their biological families, testified before a congressional subcommittee examining the historical documentation of child welfare institutions. Her testimony included a specific claim that has not been formally contradicted, that systematic requests for records submitted to the Children's Aid Society by descendants of orphan train riders had, in multiple documented cases, produced responses indicating that specific documents did not exist, documents that those same descendants had already located in other archive collections. The documents existed, the Society said they did not. That testimony is in the congressional record. It has not generated a formal investigation. It has not generated a formal response from the institution. And the records it concerned remain dispersed across multiple collections, with no centralized index, no confirmed complete inventory, and no institutional mechanism for cross-referencing what three separate archives hold against what the originating institution claims to possess. The 1930 internal review remains unpublished. No researcher has been granted access to it. The Society's institutional history references it as evidence of the programme's success and the seriousness with which the organisation evaluated its own legacy. A review of a programme's success that has never been made available to the researchers who study that programme is not evidence of transparency. It is evidence that a document exists and has been kept from the people most equipped to evaluate what it contains. Some of this can still be found, not in the gaps in what remains. The Newberry Library in Chicago holds a partial collection of placement agent correspondence from the 1880s and 1890s. Researchers who have examined those letters describe them as extraordinary documents, frank, sometimes troubling, written by agents who were navigating the gap between the Society's public language and the operational reality of placing large numbers of children with families they had met hours before. Several of those letters reference children who were returned, sent back to the Society by placing families within months of arrival. The Children's Aid Society's published records and annual reports do not systematically document returned children. The agent correspondence makes clear that returns happened with some regularity. What happened to children who were returned, whether they were replaced, whether they re-entered the New York system, whether they simply disappear from the record, cannot be determined from surviving documentation for the vast majority of cases. The Ellis Island immigration records, cross-referenced with Orphan Train intake records by several genealogists working independently in the 1990s, produced a specific and documented anomaly. A number of children whose arrival in the United States is recorded in immigration documents appear in Children's Aid Society intake records within months or weeks of their arrival, listed not as recent immigrants, but as street children or abandoned children with no family affiliation. Children who had arrived with parents and siblings in the immigration record appear in the Society's intake documentation as effectively parentless. Those children exist twice in the historical record, once as part of a family and once as alone. The transition between those two states, what happened between the immigration doc and the intake form, is not documented. Some of those children's descendants, located through genealogical research by members of the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, have produced family oral histories describing parents who searched for years for children who had been, in the family's account, taken rather than surrendered. Those accounts are oral history, not legal documentation. But they exist, they are recorded, and they are consistent with the documented discrepancy between immigration records and intake records for the same individuals. You could go to the Newbury today. You could read those letters. The handwriting is legible. The dates are clear. The questions they raise are not diminished by the passage of time. There is a building at 105 East 22nd Street in Manhattan that was, for much of the late 19th century, the administrative heart of the Children's Aid Society's operations. It is no longer a Children's Aid Society building. The institution moved. The building was repurposed. The physical space, where the decisions about 200,000 children were made and documented, no longer holds those documents. The documents moved too, in pieces, across decades, into collections that are not fully catalogued, not fully cross-referenced, and not held by any single institution with a mandate to make them comprehensively accessible. What we know with reasonable documentation is this: an institution moved 200,000 children across a continent over 75 years. It kept records. The records it kept were restructured at precisely the moment when external legal oversight began to develop. The records from the period before that restructuring have the lowest survival rate in the archive. The records most likely to document legally problematic placements without family consent, exploitative labour arrangements, children with falsified family status, are the records most comprehensively absent. An internal historical review was conducted in 1930 and has never been shared with researchers, and a formal congressional testimony documented specific instances where the institution denied the existence of records that demonstrably existed. None of this proves a coordinated, deliberate erasure of evidence for known wrongdoing. History is more complicated than that, and this narration is not in the business of declaring what cannot be proven. But consider the children whose names appear in the immigration record and nowhere else. Consider the parents who searched. Consider the 18% of intake records that noted a living relative had not consented, and then consider that the notation stopped, and the records that carried it are the most incomplete in the archive. Consider the follow-up visits that were supposed to happen, and the documentation rate of under 5% that survives to tell us whether they did. The official history of the orphan trains is a story of reformers who genuinely believed they were saving children. Many of those children were saved. That is documented, real, and should not be erased from the account. But 140,000 children who were moved by a meticulous institution and cannot be found in its surviving records are not a footnote. They are not administrative noise. They are not the inevitable casualty of 19th century record-keeping standards. They are a question. And the question is not whether the records were imperfect. The question is which records are missing, and who decided they didn't need to be found. The children are still gone. The records still don't match.